Thank you so much, Laura, and hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen now, see if this works. All right. Okay. Put that with there. Yeah, so as Laura said, I will be talking about desert plants for LA Gardens, and I first want to just share a little bit of information with everyone about the land trust. Having trouble advancing my slides. There we go. Okay. So the Mojave Desert Land Trust is located in Joshua Tree, California. And that's a picture of our offices on Highway 62, and one of our natural resource stewards doing some tortoise monitoring. So our mission is to protect the Mojave and Colorado desert ecosystems and their natural, cultural, and scenic resources. So we have a very large service area. It's about 24.5 million acres of desert. And we work in various ways to accomplish our mission. One is through land acquisition and stewardship. So we acquire land and protect rare and sensitive species and ecosystems, wildlife corridors, and public lands. And we do that in a variety of ways. We purchase private inholdings that exist within already protected areas. A lot of people don't realize that there's still a lot of private land within the national park system. So in Joshua Tree National Park or the Mojave National Preserve or Death Valley. And so we will reach out to landowners and purchase land from willing sellers. And then that land gets conveyed to the national park system. We also purchase lands outside of federally protected areas, and some of those we hold in perpetuity. And we focus mainly on wildlife corridors in the Morongo Basin and in other areas. Our main goal there is to connect these large protected areas so that wildlife can continue to move from one protected habitat to another. So connecting areas like Joshua Tree National Park with the Mojave National Preserve and maintaining that connectivity is really important. And then when we own land, we have to manage it. And so we monitor the lands routinely. We do tortoise monitoring. We monitor rare species, plants and animals, and we do restoration when it's needed. We also have a very robust education and outreach program. The photo on the right here, oh, sorry. Didn't realize that you can see my screen. So the photo on the right, we have a program called Wisdom, which is Women in Science Discovering Our Mojave. And this is a group of Wisdom interns who are monitoring the dark night sky and light pollution and taking readings. So they would go out in the middle of the night and do their work. It's definitely for young people. Then where I come in is with the plant conservation program. And we have a seed bank with over 700 collections representing over 200 taxa, which is a little less than 10% of the desert's flora that we have conserved so far. And we make most of our collections from our own lands, but from other properties as well under permit or MOU with the appropriate agencies. We also have a native plant restoration nursery. We do contract growing for restoration projects around the region. We contract seed collection for restoration, and we also have an annual community plant sale in the fall. So a lot of the plants that I'll be talking about tonight, we will be selling in October 7th. And then we recently have constructed a discovery garden, so a demonstration garden here at our headquarters. It's definitely still a work in progress, but we have some signage up now. And it's an opportunity for the public to come and see the flora, learn about it through the interpretive signage that we have, and get a sense of what these plants look like year round, and how they might behave in a garden. So that's a little bit about the Land Trust, and now I'll jump into the desert. So I just wanted to start out by talking about what a desert is, and also a little bit about what desert isn't. I'm sure I don't have, I'm preaching to the converted here. I don't have to probably tell everybody that deserts are diverse and complex ecosystems with an incredibly unique flora and fauna that is worth conserving and protecting. But it is definitely a message that still needs to get out there to a lot of the general public. It's still perceived as a wasteland in a lot of cases and barren. But approximately a third of the Earth's total land area is desert. And a quarter of California's land is actually desert. A third of our flora occurs in our deserts. And some interesting things about deserts are they're not necessarily hot. So there are a lot of different types of deserts. We have polar deserts, hot deserts, cold deserts. The deserts I'll be talking about today are California's deserts, and the plants I'll be talking about are the ones that are native to California's deserts. But, there are incredible desert plants, that from all over the world. And a lot of those will do well in LA gardens, but I am going to be just focusing on California tonight. The main thing to understand about desert plants is that, about desert ecosystems is that what they all have in common is that they receive less than 10 inches of rain annually, and they operate in a moisture deficit, which means evapotranspiration exceeds precipitation. So even the rain that they do get, they're continually kind of losing moisture. And another thing that is interesting about deserts, and is really becomes evident during periods where we do get rain and we see blooming across the desert, is that precipitation is usually distributed unevenly throughout the year and across the landscape. So one of the things that we see a lot in the desert is isolated precipitation events and scattered across the landscape. So you don't get blooming consistently across the landscape, even in a very wet year typically. The deserts are unpredictable. The climate, the precipitation is pretty characteristic. So this is a couple of maps to show you kind of the distribution of North American deserts. So what you see on the right are the deserts in North America, and on the left you can see their distribution throughout California. So in California, it appears as though the Mojave Desert is a very large desert, when in fact it's actually a very small desert, because you can see up on the right that it is just a small desert between the larger Sonoran Desert and the Great Basin. And the Mojave Desert is really considered a transition desert between the Sonoran and Great Basin deserts. And the Sonoran Desert that comes into California is there's a subdivision of the Sonoran Desert called the Colorado Desert. So what occurs in California, we actually call the Colorado Desert, and it is distinct from the Sonoran. It's drier, much drier than the Sonoran Desert to the east of the Colorado River. And so this is one of the reasons why you see saguaro cactus in Arizona, but not much in California. You have a few populations occurring very close to the Colorado River, but not much west of that because it's just simply too hot and dry to support that large of a cactus. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each one of California's deserts, and the Mojave Desert, where I'm sitting today, is unique in that it's got one rainy season in the winter. We occasionally get some monsoonal rains, but typically not very much rain in the summertime. Most of our precipitation comes in the winter. And we also have freezing temperatures at mid to high elevations. So even though the Mojave Desert has some of the lowest elevations, and it has the lowest, actually the lowest elevation in the United States, Badwater in Death Valley is in the Mojave Desert at 282 feet below sea level. So that's obviously not going to be a place where you're going to have freezing necessarily, but the Mojave Desert contrasted with the Colorado Desert does get colder because it has the higher elevation. So places where you're going to see or be in the Mojave Desert are the northern portions of Joshua Tree National Park, the Mojave National Preserve, Amboy Crater, and Death Valley National Park. And some common plants that you'll see there are creosote bush, the Joshua tree, Mojave yucca, buckhorn cholla, desert almond, ephedra, and juniper. Now, the Colorado Desert has two rainy seasons, winter and summer, so that they get the monsoonal rains that the Mojave typically does not receive. And for the most part, the Colorado Desert is at a fairly low elevation. There are some mountains that have higher elevation, but most of the desert is below 1,000 feet. And as far as gardens go and desert plants, when you're looking at plants that are native to the Colorado Desert, one thing that you want to look for is the cold hardiness, because of the low elevation, a lot of these really nice plants from the Colorado Desert are frost tender, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So it rarely freezes in the winter, except at higher elevation. Summer temps are very high, and they're typically anywhere from 10, 15, sometimes 20 degrees warmer in Palm Springs, south of Joshua Tree, than it is here. So the Colorado Desert, where you'd run into that would be the southern portion of Joshua Tree National Park, Anza Borrego State Park, Thousand Palms Oasis Preserve, Coachella Valley, places like that. And common plants there are creosote bush, ocotillo, which is in this picture here, palo verde, teddy bear cholla, brittle bush, tuberosa, and jojoba. And then we go to the Southern Great Basin Desert. So there's just a very small portion of this desert that creeps into California, up around the Eastern Sierra and the White and Inyo Mountains. Most of this desert is actually east of us in Nevada and Utah and Eastern Oregon. So it's known for high elevation and very cold temperatures in winter. Most of the precipitation in this desert actually falls as snow. And common plants here is very different floristically: sagebrush, rabbitbrush, winter fat, saltbush, greasewood, and conifers like junipers, pines, and firs. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some common characteristics of desert plants, because they do a lot of times tend to have a lot of common traits that people like or don't like, or you really want to take into consideration when you're designing a garden, and how foliage, for example, plays off each other. So they typically have small leaves, and this is an adaptation to desert life, to the heat and drought, because small leaves have less surface area. So that means less surface area for transpiration. It helps reduce moisture loss. Foliage often tends to be gray-green to silvery white, fuzzy or waxy. And similarly, this is an adaptation to reduce moisture loss. The hairs reflect light and heat, and they help retain moisture close to the surface of the leaf. Thorns, spines, and prickles. So I know a lot of people associate cacti with the desert. There are a lot more plants in the desert than cacti, especially in the Mojave Desert and the Great Basin. But those spines, not only do they protect the plant from herbivory, a lot of animals are going to want to try to get that moisture that's in those succulent stems, but they also create shade and they reduce moisture loss from the stem. And succulents is the next one. This is also an adaptation to retain moisture. So the spines help protect that succulents and help create shade for the plant. Another thing that is common to desert plants is summer dormancy or deciduousness. And it's not true for all plants. In fact, the opposite is true when you get into riparian areas around desert springs or around the Colorado River, where you have honey mesquites and palo verdes. They may drop their leaves if it starts to get dry, but they tend to grow when it's warm. But a lot of the other plants that are from upland habitats, it will go very dormant in the summer, and they'll drop their leaves to help just get through these harsh times. So it, again, another adaptation to the extreme conditions. Some of the shrubs I'm going to show you tonight, a lot of the shrubs tend to be slow growing and long-lived, which is can be a nice feature if you're patient, but can also be somewhat frustrating. Growth is responsive to environmental conditions. And this is a kind of an important one, and it's a really interesting one, I think, because you can see the same plant in different parts of the desert, and depending on where it's growing and its access to water, or depending on how windy the area is, or any number of other factors, the plant might be 3 feet high, or it could be 8 feet high. And this is something that is really important to understand when you're bringing desert plants into to a garden in Los Angeles. Don't expect it to behave exactly the same way as it does in the desert. It's going to respond to the conditions in your garden, and most likely its growth habit, its growth rate is going to be affected by the conditions. And typically, the conditions in LA are more favorable than they are in the desert, so it's going to respond. Another common characteristic in the desert is that there are very few trees. And I get asked a lot for recommendations for native trees for gardens, and there just really aren't that many, especially trees that are native to upland areas, because there's simply not enough water to support trees. So there's a reason why there aren't trees in the desert. Where we do see trees are in areas where there's a high water table, so around springs, rivers, and oases. And I'll be showing some of those trees in a minute. A lot of desert plants have extensive root systems that tap into surface moisture or groundwater, or both. Creosote bush is one that's known for having a really extensive root system that's both deep and wide. Cacti, on the other hand, their root systems tend to be more shallow, but really, really widespread. And some of the cholla out here, like the silver cholla, can have roots that run for many, many feet. I haven't even found the end of them in some cases. Sometimes after a flash flood, you'll see where soil has eroded and exposed the root system of a plant. And it's really, really impressive to see the way that some of these plants are able to find moisture. Like any native plant, desert plants also have really high habitat value for native wildlife. Pollinators, and are the ones we typically think of when we think of plants and flowers, but also they're really important for desert tortoise, and all of the other animals that burrow underground. Having a shrub or some sort of structure in the ground to help support the soil for them to build their burrows. Tortoise are very closely associated with creosote because they often build their burrows under them. Also, while I've been out seed collecting, I've come across a coyote den underneath a very large old creosote. And then this last one is quite important. Desert plants are adapted to high heat, intense UV, low humidity, and they tend to prefer good drainage. It's not true of every plant. There's exceptions to everything. But having lived now in Los Angeles and gardened in Los Angeles and in the Mojave, I can really see the difference in how these plants respond to heat, light, and aridity. And just because an environment is less extreme doesn't necessarily mean that the plants are going to prefer it. So in some cases, you might see a plant like creosote that has a particular growth habit in the desert, bring it into LA, and it's going to be very leggy. And it's not going to have that kind of look that you expect. I've talked with some landscapers who have been working with some desert plants in the Los Angeles area, and creosote's one of the ones that they've said doesn't really grow well there for them. If anyone else has a different experience, I'd be very interested in hearing about it. So these are some of the challenges as I see them to growing desert plants in Los Angeles or coastal regions or anywhere. I mean, Los Angeles is a big place. So one of the things that I encountered when I was living in LA was heavy clay soils. And I know they're very common there. And that can be challenging for a lot of desert species, all the ones that require good drainage. So some of the plants I'll be talking about, some of the Penstemons, some of the sages, they might not do well in certain parts of LA. Too much winter rain is one that could potentially be an issue. And I bring it up just because I know that you all had a very rainy winter recently, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some loss during a winter like that. If you're trying to grow certain desert plants, not only because it's a lot of moisture and not really time to dry out between rain events, but also because it tends to be cloudy. And one of the things these plants really need is sun. Then if it's too cool or humid in the spring and summer, so think June gloom, it can be a bit of an issue for some of these plants. And I made a note here. So as I was putting this together, this was a couple of weekends ago, I was looking to see what the weather was in Los Angeles to compare it to Joshua Tree, and it was 93 degrees in Joshua Tree that day, and it was 78 in Los Angeles. That's quite a big difference. I know it's warmed up for you guys, but but there can be, you know, a gray kind of foggy marine layer that comes in, at least closer to the coast, that can be a bit of an issue. So the plants I've chosen to talk about today are ones that I think are not terribly fussy. Some of them might be very familiar, maybe a lot of them very familiar with folks, because I also wanted to choose plants that you would be able to find if you wanted them. But at the end, I'm going to talk about a few plants that really aren't that common in the trade that I think are worth trying out. So for trees, I know most, if not everyone's probably familiar with desert willow and palo verde. Desert ironwood is a lot less common. We don't see it much being used even in landscaping in the desert, but I have seen it available from some wholesalers in the low desert, and we've put some in our demonstration garden. Screwbean and honey mesquite are also really nice trees. However, they have some pretty gnarly thorns. So that's true of the palo verde too. Desert Museum is a cultivar that's become quite common and well known because it's thornless. And Chilean mesquite is used a lot out here as an alternative, a thornless alternative to honey mesquite. But I do think that it's worth giving these, the honey mesquite and screwbean mesquite, a place in the garden if you have room for it, because they are really beautiful. They attract a lot of wildlife. This is the lovely, one of the lovely thorns on honey mesquite. They're not really to be messed with. So if you're going to grow this tree, you want to trim it up to keep the thorns kind of out of the way. But the flowers are great for pollinators, and the honey mesquite pods, and this is true of the screwbean mesquite pods as well. They're very sweet, and you can take these pods and grind them into a flour and use it in smoothies, or you can use it to bake with. It's very sweet and very nutritious, and it's a very important food plant, both for wildlife, but more importantly for Native Americans. And you can pay a lot of money to buy mesquite flour at health food stores, but if you have your own, it's a lot cheaper. One thing to know about these trees is that they do naturally grow near water, and they can have pretty destructive root systems. So you do not want to plant it near a sidewalk or very close to the foundation of a house. So you do need some space to plant a tree like this. Some medium to large shrubs that are really nice are bladderpod, salt bushes, and Apache plume. Bladderpod is pretty commonly available, and there are a few different varieties of bladderpod, and it does also grow along the coast. I imagine that the one in the desert is a different variety, but they are very drought tolerant. They attract hummingbirds, butterflies. It's a host plant for several different butterflies, including, I think it's the Becker's white is one of them. They attract native bees as well. And one of the nice things about this shrub is that it blooms in January. Oftentimes it'll start blooming in January and it'll bloom all through the spring. And if you water it occasionally, it might even bloom some more. And out here, it tends to stop blooming in the summer, in the hottest part of the summer. But with a little bit of supplemental water, you can keep it blooming almost year round. Apache plume is a really beautiful shrub in the rose family that is pretty when it's in flower, but I think it's the prettiest when it's actually going to seed, because it has these plumes, these plumed seed heads that are just beautiful when they are backlit. They catch the light and kind of wave in the wind. This plant can spread by rhizomes though, and it gets quite large, so you do need to have some space for it. And then saltbush, I've put a couple pictures here. The one on the right is Atriplex lentiformis, which is quail bush or big saltbush. The photo on the left here is the seed, the fruits of Atriplex canescens or four-wing saltbush. And these are great just if you want like a big wall of shrub. And they don't have showy flowers, but they have this really dense gray-green foliage, and they're great for wildlife. The four-wing saltbush becomes more noticeable in the fall, usually around November, when it's starting to produce these fruits. And for a period of time, they're chartreuse almost, and then they gradually turn brown. But this shrub is a really good example of one that's going to be really responsive to its environment. You'll see it in its habitat and up in places like Death Valley, like the four-wing saltbush, where it'll be 2 or 3 feet high. You put it in clay soil in a garden in LA, and it's going to get 7 feet tall. So that's just something to be aware of. It's some of these shrubs, it's hard to predict, if not impossible to predict, what their mature size is actually going to be. Nice thing about some of these, like the saltbush, is that they do take pruning. So you might be able to keep it a little bit smaller if you want to. Then a few more shrubs are the jojoba, which is also called goat nut sometimes. This is the same plant that is used for jojoba oil. And jojoba grows mostly down in the low desert at lower elevations, as well. Actually, all three of these plants do. Desert lavender and tuberosa are all very common at lower elevations. And this does mean that they do tend to be frost tender. So if you tend to freeze in the winter time, then you might either lose the plant if it's a really hard freeze, or you might have some dieback. If it's not that cold, or if the freezing temperatures don't last for very long, you might just have some burned foliage and branches it'll just come back. We've lost, because we get so cold here, we do have desert lavender in our demonstration garden. We lost one, the other one died back completely, but then the next, in the spring, it started resprouting from the base. One thing to know about jojoba, it's a really nice shrub with leathery leaves. It's kind of similar to a manzanita, but without the red bark. I have seen jojobas get quite large and be pruned up almost into a tree shape, a small tree. They are dioecious, so you're only going to get fruit on the female plants. And only if you have a male plant nearby. They're wind pollinated, so the plant doesn't have to be too close. And if you have a neighbor who has a male, it might pollinate a female. But you do have to have both. And there are also some milkweeds and the Baja fairy duster and the desert broom. These also make really nice kind of medium to large size shrubs. I chose the rush milkweed, Asclepias subulata, because it tends to be a bit more adaptable, as opposed to the Asclepias erosa, which is the desert milkweed that we have more commonly in this area in the Mojave Desert. If you're interested in the desert milkweed, it does need to have deep sandy soil. And so it's not a plant that we can grow just anywhere in the desert. If you have rocky, gravelly, shallow soil, it's not going to grow. It tends to grow in washes, where the sand is deep and drains really well. Baja fairy duster is one that I'm sure folks are very familiar with. This photograph here by Barbara Eisenstein was taken at the Prisk Elementary School garden that was designed and is still, I think, maintained by Mike Littorello. It's a beautiful garden. He has it broken up into different eco zones, and so there is a desert section, and if you're looking to see what will grow in that part of Long Beach, desert plants that'll grow there, it's definitely a place that you should visit. I talked to Mike before giving this presentation because I wanted to understand better what his climate was like there, because it surprised me that he was able to grow so many desert plants that close to the coast. And one of the things that he shared with me is that it is a bit of a peculiar spot there. It's very hot, and they don't get as much of the marine influence as you would expect that other parts of Long Beach get. So it is very hot and sunny. For smaller shrubs and perennials, Brittlebush is a nice one that I know is becoming more and more common in the LA area thanks to Caltrans. I think it's in one of their seed mixes that they spray along the side of the highways. And it's even up here along the side of some of our highways where it wouldn't normally be. And then, but it does well, and it can be frost tender though, so that's something to be aware of. And Indian mallow as well is quite frost tender. We're trying to grow it here in our demonstration garden, and it's a bit hit or miss for us, but one of the things that we're finding is working quite well, at least for now, is planting it on the south side of a building against a hot wall. That does tend to, the ones that we've planted there have fared much better than in other locations. So, and if it can handle the south wall of a building in Joshua Tree, this is a plant that can seriously handle some heat. The pink fairy duster is obviously related to the red fairy duster. They're both calliandras, but they're quite different in the way that they grow. The red fairy duster is very fast growing, whereas the pink fairy duster is rather slow growing, smaller, but very nice, great for pollinators. Tends to be winter deciduous as well, at least here. That could just be a function of the cold. And apricot mallow, another one that I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with. This is another great plant with some cultivars out there. And one of the reasons why I like this plant so much is that it has a special relationship with certain bees. It attracts mallow bees, which are specialists on mallow flowers. And I like any flower that attracts a particular kind of insect, because I love those relationships, and it just speaks to how important having these native plants around is when you have that kind of those dependencies, and there are those interdependencies. So some other small shrubs. White sage isn't necessarily a small shrub, but it's also not a big shrub, so I put it in here. We do have white sage in the desert, and it's not terribly common, but it is here. We have other sages that I'm going to talk about that we see more often, but we have California fuchsia as well. The fuchsia is a nice plant because it tolerates a lot of different soils. It's very adaptable to heavy soils or sandy soils. It's also really adaptable to different levels of light. And so one of the things that we pay attention to when we're choosing what we're going to grow for our sales is where do these plants naturally occur? And so California fuchsia is one of those plants that when we find it, it tends to be growing in a canyon at the base of a rock. And so it's getting sheltered for at least part of the day from the harshest heat of the sun. So we find that it does tolerate full sun, but it also can handle some shade. And then penstemons. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about both the sages and the penstemons, just because there's so many species in the desert and they're all amazing. So the sages. Mojave sage is one of my favorites. It smells incredible. And it has these flowers that are almost a sky blue, and they're surrounded, by a calyx, by these bracts, which are kind of a yellow green, and they're quite large. So it's unique for a sage. It's not going to be the easiest sage to grow in the garden, though. I suspect it's going to want really good drainage and very little water. This is one that's been kind of hit or miss for us. It's where it likes, when it's happy, it does really, really well. And so the one in this photo is obviously a very happy plant. This is a situation in which the plants are not on irrigation. They only get hand watered very infrequently. And they're also on the east side of our greenhouse. So they're getting afternoon shade. And that could be part of it. Where they're in the demonstration garden and they're in full sun and on a drip system where they get watered once a week, they're doing okay, but not nearly as well. And then where I planted them at home, which we have very shallow soil, they are doing really, really bad. So I planted 3, 2 of them are gone. One of them looks very unhappy. So I think the soils are going to be really important here, and potentially the amount of sun and watering too. Desert sage, which is Salvia dorii. This is one that's also can be fussy. It's not only difficult to grow in the garden, but it's also difficult to propagate in the nursery, which I think is probably one of the reasons why we don't see it a whole lot. But we have been able to grow some plants successfully from cuttings and seed. But again, we don't get a lot of plants in production. And that it's just a pretty fussy one. But if you can get it to grow, it's stunning. And it has these beautiful blue flowers and kind of red purple calyx that is kind of hairy. The variety here is pilosa, called that for the fine hairs on the calyx. And then we have blue sage, also I usually call it mountain sage, but Salvia pachyphylla. And this is one that has a really large flower that's very, very showy, and a large kind of spoon-shaped leaf. This is also one of my favorites. And this should do fairly well in a well-draining soil with minimal water. Now the Penstemons, firecracker penstemon, I know, and also the scarlet bugler, Penstemon centranthifolius, are pretty common in the trade. I see Palmer's penstemon occasionally, but not as often, and Penstemon pseudospectabilis, which is the desert penstemon. One that's much less common is the Mojave beard tongue. That's Penstemon incertus. This is one that that we find up here, very cold tolerant, and very drought tolerant. And what we found with this one is that it really does not like to be on irrigation. So it's not very forgiving when it comes to overwatering. So I think it's going to want to have a very well draining soil and be watered minimally. We planted a number of these plants on an irrigation system in rows where we grow plants just to produce seed. And most of them ended up, they grew really fast, but then they died at the end of the first year. And then so we tried again planting them in that same area as the Mojave Sage on the east side of the greenhouse with only minimal hand watering, and they are doing much, much better. And now cacti and succulents. So we've got a lot of cacti and succulents that are native to the California desert. Desert agave, Agave utahensis is another one that's less common in the trade. Beaver tail cactus, hedgehog cactus is not easy to find, but we do grow it when we can. It's best grown from seed, although it can be grown from stem cuttings, and which kind of surprised me, but I did see that the Desert Botanic Garden in Phoenix has been successfully growing it from stem cuttings. The chaparral yucca is not one that people often associate with the desert, but it does grow here in the desert transition zone between the chaparral and desert. So we do see it around Whitewater Preserve and maybe Pioneer Town Mountains Preserve too. But most commonly here in the Joshua Tree area, we see the Mojave yucca and Yucca shadigera. It's a very large yucca, but very slow growing. Banana yucca too. This is one that we see more often in the Mojave Preserve. And also a large but slow growing yucca, and ocotillo. So ocotillo is native to the Colorado desert. We don't have it in the Mojave Desert at higher elevations unless it's been planted. And so it is a common landscaping plant up here, and it does do fairly well. It's also pretty slow growing. And according to Marina Wagner, who's a landscape architect in the LA area who works a lot with desert plants, she says it can be tricky in LA. And she recommends Fucaria McDougallii as a substitute if you're finding the splendens to be challenging. Then I wanted to just make sure to, talk conservation and how important it is to buy from reputable sources, because Dudleya's, agaves, phaerocactus, a lot of these native cacti and succulents are being poached. It is a real problem. And I was talking with someone from the BLM recently who said that, I guess not that long ago, a bunch of Dudleya saxosas were poached from the Kingston Range, which is just north of the Mojave Preserve. So it's still happening, and just make sure that you know your source. And I have a photograph here of some Dudleya saxosas that we are growing in our nursery from seed. And that seed was collected from MDLT property. And so, you know, we're one of those sources. I know the Theodore Payne Foundation is a good source. So just be aware that that's still happening, still a problem, unfortunately. Some ornamental grasses that we have in the desert. Deer grass, I'm sure most folks are familiar with because it's very common in the nursery trade, but it is also a desert plant, and we have it in a lot of different parts of the desert, the Bighorn Mountains. It's in Joshua Tree, and so it's definitely around. And we also have this desert needlegrass, which is Stipa speciosa, and it does make a nice smaller ornamental grass than the deer grass, and it has a nice kind of plumed seed head, or inflorescence there when it's going to seed. And then Sporobolus aeroides, or alkali sacchaton, is another one that has a really attractive look to it when it's blooming. And I'm going to talk about container plants too, and any of these grasses, mostly the needlegrass and the alkali sacchaton, would do well in a pot, and deer grass too if the pot's big enough. But any of the cacti, agaves, any of the cacti and succulents are going to make excellent container plants. And anything that, if you have heavy soil or you're having difficulty growing something in the ground, I would recommend trying it in a container. Ocotillos, for example, can be grown in containers. Penstemon can be grown in containers. We have, I'm going to talk about an Ericameria that we grow here that I like a lot, Ericameria cuneata, that surprisingly is really pretty in a container and kind of spills over the edge, and kind of in a, just kind of almost climbing or kind of a cascading. Here are some plants that I think would be worth trying if you're able to find them from a local source. Mojave sandwort, Aramogone macrodinia. This is one that I was completely unfamiliar with before I moved here, and came across this very plant for the first time on one of MDLT's properties, just north of here, not far from Pioneer Town. And we have struggled to grow it in the demonstration garden, but it does do well in containers. And it's just a beautiful little plant. It looks almost like a tufted grass. It's very kind of a clumping tufted plant, but it's in the I'm going to forget what family it's in now, but the leaves are very spiky, so it looks like a soft little plant, but when you touch it, it's a little mean guy. But the flowers are really pretty, and they can vary from white to pink and yellow. The paper bagbush is a really interesting plant in the mint family, Scutellaria mexicana, and it has these really beautiful two-toned flowers, white and purple, that attract hummingbirds and native bees. And when after the flowers get pollinated and they start to produce seed, the calyx of the flower starts to expand and create this bag, this sac around the developing seeds. And at first they are kind of a pinkish purple, and then they get more and more pale as the larger they get, and then they dry out completely and are really beautiful at every stage. So the light catches them, and you can even see the seeds inside of this one little inflated bag here. This is one that I would imagine would like to have good drainage, although it could do well in clay. It would be one to try out. I would expect it to want full sun and a lot of heat. Otherwise, I wouldn't be surprised if it would tend to get a little leggy. I actually tried this in my garden in LA. It did not do well, but it was also not in the best spot. So I had heavy soil, it was getting too much shade, but I still think it's worth trying because it's such an interesting plant. A few more here that are just kind of near and dear to my heart. First, the Ericomeria cuneata, which is on the bottom right here. This is cliff golden bush, and this is how they grow in the wild. They're absolutely amazing. They literally grow out of crevices in boulders on vertical surfaces. So this is just a boulder wall, and this plant is coming out of this crevice and just spilling down the wall. And they also grow in between boulders on, horizontal surfaces. But I just think it's incredible to see plants growing like this in places that you would think that a plant just simply can't grow. And we have tried this in our demonstration garden, and it's doing very well. And we didn't even try to mimic this kind of bouldery situation. It just would have been really difficult. So we just grew it. We're growing them in the ground next to boulders, but in soil, and they're doing surprisingly well. They've grown a lot. This is an Ericomeria that blooms in the fall. So another nice fall blooming plant, like the epilobium or the California fuchsia. I know we don't have a lot of plants that bloom in the fall, so if you're looking for fall color, this would be a good one. And like all the Ericomerias, it's a great pollinator plant. It attracts a lot of butterflies and native bees. Perry's jujube up in the right, upper right, is another one of my favorites. It's this one grows, we see it mostly in Morongo Valley, between as you're leaving Yucca Valley and going back toward LA. You'll see this on the hills, and it's really beautiful in the springtime because it's winter deciduous, but then the color of the leaves in the springtime, when it leaves out, it's just that really bright green that looks so fresh and stands out against all the other plants on the hillside. And then it flowers and produces this fruit, which is bright yellow and mostly pit, like a lot of wild fruits. But the skin is edible. It's nothing like a jujube that you'd buy in the store, but it is edible. Some taste better than others, but the tree does have spines on it, some thorns here, but it's just a really beautiful, beautiful shrub, large shrub or small tree. And then the desert almond. This is really common around here, and you'll see it a lot in Joshua Tree National Park as you're driving through. And one of the things about this that gets people's attention when they're out here is in the winter time, once it's leafed out. This one's summer deciduous, so during the hottest, driest time of the year, it tends to drop most of its leaves, and then it leaves out again in the winter time, and usually it starts blooming in January. And when it's all leafed out like this, the western tent moth comes and lays her eggs, and the tent moth caterpillars build these large webbed chambers where all the caterpillars will live and feed and develop. and they're very conspicuous and on the branches of the plants. And so, but it is a native moth. It's all good. So we like to see plants, performing their function in the ecosystem. So the moths don't, or the caterpillars don't do a lot of damage, but you will see that in the desert if you're here at the right time of year. And then it produces these small fuzzy fruits that do have a pit in them, which tastes more like an almond than an almond does. It's so strong, but it is like a lot of pits in the in this family, and in the stone fruit family. It does contain traces of cyanide in it, so I don't recommend eating them in large amounts or eating them at all, perhaps. But I have tasted them and they're pretty good. And then I just wanted to maybe preempt any questions about the Western Joshua tree, because I know that this has been in the news a lot. And you might be wondering why I didn't include the Joshua tree on my list of plants to grow in Los Angeles. And the reason why is because it is now officially a protected species. It was not listed by the state Endangered Species Act, but it is protected now by something called the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. And so this act does prohibit any person or public agency from importing into the state, exporting out of the state, or taking, possessing, purchasing, or selling within the state a Western Joshua tree or any part or product of the tree. That's where it stands now. However, we are working with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife on a permit that may allow us to grow and sell Joshua trees to the public, but that's a process that has to play out. So in the meantime, they are protected by this act, and we cannot make the plants available to the public. I also caution folks from moving plants around too much. I think that, we want to be not just good horticulturists, but good conservationists, and knowing where to move plants and where not to move plants is really important. And so is it appropriate to bring Joshua trees into LA? I don't know the answer to that, but it is something to think about. And when you are choosing what plants to bring into your garden, you do want to think about how they're going to interact with the ecosystem. Things like buckwheats, which I intentionally did not include in my talk, hybridize very easily with other buckwheats. And so, bringing in a variety or species of buckwheat that could potentially hybridize with local populations and, bring in, introduce maladaptive traits and whatnot. These are things to consider. Also, any plants that could become weedy. We don't, want to create the next, invasive plant, whether it's from the desert in California or from somewhere else outside of California. The idea of what's native, what's local is something to really give a lot of thought to. In my research for this presentation, I was reading a little bit about the honey mesquite, and in a lot of places in the world, it's considered an incredibly invasive plant. And so, we want to do what's right by the environment and our local ecosystems. So I just put up some pictures here and some locations of places to see desert gardens if you're wanting to, get ideas for other plants that might be appropriate or just beautiful, kind of going off in the other direction now. But, we know the Huntington has an amazing desert garden. The Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix is incredible. And then there are some lesser known botanic gardens. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Morton and Palm Springs, but it's definitely worth a visit if for no other reason than to go into the cactarium. The Living Desert in Palm Springs is also a great place. They have been focusing more on their wildlife than on their gardens in recent years, but I think that might be changing. And then there's Sunnylands in Palm Springs. If you're looking for some design ideas, they really have done a wonderful job with mass plantings of cacti and succulents. The Arizona Sonora Desert and Tucson, Tohono Chul in Tucson, and the Ethel M. Botanical Cactus Garden in Henderson, Nevada, which also has some connection to chocolate, which is reason enough, I think, to go visit that one. And that's it. So I hope that you enjoyed that and that you'll visit MDLT.org and check out what we do. And you're always welcome to come and visit our garden. You can email me if you have any questions, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
You can stop sharing, or you can leave this up for a little while, whatever you want to do. Well, there we go.
I guess I stopped sharing.
No problem. We do have a couple of questions. Thank you so much, Madena. That was really interesting, especially about the Joshua trees. I did not know that that law was now in effect.
Yes, very recent, as of last week, or even maybe this week.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
I think there's some nurseries out there that have some Joshua trees for sale. So we'll have to figure out what we're going to do with that.
Yeah.
So we do have some questions up. I did want to, we've got a couple of comments also from the chat, and did want to also let everybody know that we do have a door prize tonight, or virtual door prize. Madena was generously offered to send 3 seed packets to people. So it's going to be a surprise. We don't know what they'll be yet, but we're going to have 2 lucky winners of the people that are still out there on the Zoom. So if I can take a break, and we're going to do the spin the wheel of names, and we'll try to get 2 people while you all think of what other questions you want to ask Madena, because it's about 8:45, and let's get the wheel of names out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get to that real fast here. There it is, my wheel of names. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this. And if any of you are still out there, I want you to use your raise your hand function, and then we will see if you're there. Diane Radigan, are you there? Diane, if you're there, raise your hand. I know we have a couple of people that have left already. No, Diane. Okay, we're going to go again. We have somebody, Shirley Coast. Okay, let's try this one more time. And this is for seed packets from Madena Asbell and the Mojave Desert Land Trust. Stephanie Debsky, are you out there? Go ahead and raise your hand. Not seeing anybody. Stephanie, are you there? No? Okay, we're gonna try this one more time. And hopefully we will pick up somebody. How about Viva Krasinski? Are you out there? Let me see, make sure anybody, nobody's on the chat either. Okay, we're gonna try this again at the end of the question and answer. I don't want to take up too many people's time. And if nobody is out there, then you can save some postage. I'm gonna go back to stopping sharing my screen and go back to Madena. And let's go to our questions. George Zhang asks, I'm curious about what habitat Salvia apiana occurs in the desert and any ethnobotanical use for the tribes.
Yeah, so in our area where we're finding it, it's almost pinyon juniper woodland. It's up pretty high elevation. And where we're at now, it's Serrano territory. So the if it had use for them, it would have been Serrano, Kauai also, and there's some Chemehuevi presence here as well. So it would have had most likely a ceremonial use.
Okay. And it looks like you already answered his other question. He was asking what the name of the landscape professional that was working with desert plants that you had talked to about the Ocotillo, and that would be Marina Wagner.
Yeah, Marina
Cactus LA.
Wagner. Yeah, Cactus LA Garden. Right.
Anybody else who wants to ask some questions, feel free to send those in. And let's take a look at our comments over here. George Sang also mentioned that the UA Maricopa County certified arborist said that if you clip the thorns off of honey mesquite, they won't grow back. Any comments on that?
Huh.
Seems like that'd be a lot of work.
It would be. And for a while it'd be pretty painful.
Yeah.
Till you got most of them. But yeah, and I see Orchid wrote that you've seen it in Anza Borrego. Yeah, it's fairly widespread, especially more east of us. And I know that someone with the San Bernardino public spaces was telling me there's a park, I think it's called Etowanda Park. It's near San Bernardino. And I guess they have a real poaching problem there. So that's something that, get the word out about white sage poaching, because it's a big problem.
Yeah, there's we had a screening of Saging the World.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Which is if you all could, I think it's available now on YouTube. It was put out by the California Native Plant Society in conjunction with some tribal folks down south. And I think there were a couple of other people that sponsored it, but that's a really interesting short documentary about the issue of white sage poaching.
Yeah.
We do have a couple questions in the chat section. Marty Caruso asks, can I grow bladder pod from the seeds? She lives in Lancaster and the bushes have many pods on them. What do you think?
Oh yeah, super easy to grow from seed. The trick with bladder pod is to grow it, to germinate the seed in the fall. It's very particular about the temperature at which it will germinate. So fall, winter, it's got to be below 60 degrees at night, fairly consistently. You might get some germination at slightly higher temperatures, but once it starts to warm up like now, you're not going to get any germination.
I actually had a question myself with desert plants because of the different climate regarding rainfall. When is usually the best time to plant them? Is it in the fall, like a lot of our coastal California natives, or is it in the early spring after the cold time?
I tell everyone to plant in the fall. And if it's there are some things that are going to be a little tender just because they're young. And so maybe wrap those up if you're expecting freakish, like hard freeze. But usually what will damage them is a kind of a freak freeze, where you're going from it being relatively warm to all of a sudden cold. If it happens incrementally, then they'll usually be fine. But I find that planting in the spring can be really difficult, and it just requires so much watering to get these things going. And yeah, it's just too hot.
We've got a lot of comments in the comment list too. Oh, here's one. How would you describe the water quality? Oh, how would you describe the water quality at your facility? Have you found this to be of concern in cultivating desert species? I think that's directed to you.
It has not been a problem. Our water is pretty alkaline. We have municipal water, but it's still pretty alkaline. But the plants here can tolerate that really well. So yeah, we have not had any issues with it, at least not that we've been able to identify as being a water issue. And interestingly, we have a contract that we're growing for. We're just starting in the next couple of weeks. We're growing about 20,000 plants for the Salton Sea for dust suppression and habitat restoration around there. And so it's all halophytes, salt-loving, salt-tolerant plants. We actually have to water those plants with salt water as part of the contract to get them acclimated, because I guess the folks who are doing the actual planting have tried planting plants grown without having been exposed to salt water, and they've died. So they have to get acclimated. So that's going to be a really interesting process. But
Wow.
we're working with, we're partnering with California Botanic Garden on that one.
Cool. We've got a couple shout outs for some of the species you mentioned: Agave utahensis, Echinocereus engelmannii. These are all great landscape plants. There's a comment from George Zhang. The Joshua tree seeds sold online and at NPS souvenir stores. He says they're Eastern Joshua tree, Yucca brevifolia jaegeriana.
Yeah.
Is that also a protected species?
It's not. It's only the Western Joshua tree right now. And I think part of the reason for that, and for the sense of urgency around protecting it, is because climate models and population work that's been done on that is showing significant declines in recruitment throughout the southern portion of its range, which happens to be Joshua Tree National Park. So I don't know, if folks haven't been following it, there's a very significant likelihood that over the next century, that there will be very few, like 0.02% or something like that, of the population remaining within the boundaries of Joshua Tree National Park. And that's, even a best case scenario. So it's pretty dire, but it is also important to understand that the park is the southern extension of the Joshua Trees range, and there's still a lot that we don't know about the population further north and how that's going to fare. So one of the things MDLT is very involved in, or will be very involved in, is facilitating research. And the Joshua Tree Genome Project has been working really hard on genetics, but understanding, getting some climate models and things going to find out where are those climate refugia for the Joshua tree, and how can organizations like MDLT target land acquisition to conserve those areas where hopefully the tree will persist. So the Eastern Joshua tree it occurs, basically most of the trees, not all of them, but most of the trees that are in the Mojave National Preserve are the Eastern Joshua tree. It is different. It has a different pollinator. It's also a yucca moth, but it's a different species. The flower morphology is a little bit different. But it currently is not, been deemed to need protection right now.
Is that little population in the valley and the grapevine still existing?
I don't know.
I think a fire went through there a couple years ago. I remember seeing it with your, driving up north on the 5, and you look over and you're like, oh my God, there's Joshua trees. It was just in this one little section. So I don't know. I think somebody told me that was the furthest northern population, but I think it was unclear whether they were a natural population or if somehow they've been moved there. Somebody's asking if the Joshua trees in the Antelope Valley and the tree are now protected.
Yes, those would be the Western Joshua tree. Yeah.
Okay. And then somebody asked, what is the yellow flower in your background photo?
Oh, Pectus paposa, chinchweed.
Gingeweed?
Chinchweed, Pectus paposa. It's a summer annual. So I took this picture 2 summers ago. We had a really wet summer. We had a summer super bloom. It was amazing. And up here we get chinchweed and fringed amaranth and borhavia, and we get some really adorable little annual grasses, little boutelouas, Bouteloua barbata and Bouteloua aristodoides. And so that was a really nice summer, because usually there's not too much to see. But these are also the pectus and the amaranth are also really important tortoise forage plants, because of there not being a whole lot for the tortoises to eat that time of year. But they'll come out in a wet summer to feed.
Neat. We've got maybe a question or possibly just a comment about fungus on Palo Verdes in the LA Basin.
I do not know about
I know living in coastal California, coastal Ventura, you really can't plant Palo Verdes here. Even Desert Museum, they just get covered in powdery mildew most of the year. So probably not until you get into the inland valleys are they really happy.
Okay, that doesn't surprise me. I would think that would be true for probably a few of the things that I've shown, like some of the sages. I know, they'll get powdery mildew if they don't have enough sun. And so yeah, the coastal areas can be problematic for desert plants for sure. But I don't know about a fungus on the Palo Verdes.
I think it's just like a powdery mildew. And then we have a bunch of comments about places that you can see desert plants in the LA area, including the nature gardens at the Natural History Museum. Besides the gardens that you already mentioned, the Huntington Springs Preserve Botanical Garden in Las Vegas. And thought there was one, the Gottlieb Native Garden that many of us in LA know from being on the Theodore Payne Foundation tours.
And TPF itself.
And Theodore Payne Foundation itself. Hi, Carol.
Hello.
Sneaking
Madena
in
knows
there,
about
but
that.
she just looks like a flower.
LA Gardens. Yeah.
All right, so we are winding down in our comments. And I did have one more question regarding the Mojave Desert Land Trust plant sales, which I think you have once or twice a year, and I've heard that there's a little bit of a traffic jam.
Yeah, we actually just had a meeting about that today. So yes, we right now we're trying to just have one sale a year in the fall, because the spring it's not a great time to plant, but also the sales, if anyone's done a plant sale, you know how hard it is, especially when you're an organization that's not really set up for retail. And so it's a big deal. So yeah, so right now we're trying to just keep it to a fall plant sale. It's going to be on October 7th. It has become insanely popular, and to the point where people are lining up hours before we open, and it's a bit of a mad rush. So we were talking today about how to utilize the space better so that people can maneuver, so that there's more holding area for people, for anyone, if anyone's out there who's been to our plant sale, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we're just trying to improve the logistics so that it's just a better experience for everyone and more streamlined, fewer bottlenecks and things like that. I'm sure we'll get some things right and we'll get a lot of things wrong, but we're always trying to make it better and to try to figure out how to do that. We have limited space here, and so we can only do so much, but we're always trying to improve it.
Do you ever sell plants outside of sale days, or maybe seeds by mail?
We do sell seeds by mail. So if you go to the website, you'll find what's available. There's not a lot right now. But we usually let the inventory kind of get pretty low this time of year because we've got other things that we're working on, and then we build the inventory back up for the fall. So because that's when a lot of things are better to be sown anyway. So if you don't see much on the website right now, just wait, and usually by mid-September, we should have more inventory up.
Great. Well, I think it's about 9 o'clock, and I think we can start wrapping things up. We do have one more comment from Mike with the Prisk Elementary School garden. He's saying
Yeah.
Palos Verdes grow fine in Long Beach. Well, Mike can grow just about anything. I think the Prisk Elementary has just about every plant in California. Some
Yeah.
short of maybe some alpine stuff. So I think if you can, again, find the right climate for it and take care to listen to the advice that you gave us tonight regarding location and soil and watering, I think a lot of these plants have a good chance of growing in the LA area. All right, so I want to thank you again, Madena, and just remind people again, we do not have a meeting in August. We will resume in September with our new plant introductions meeting. And then we have the Horticulturist of the Year coming up in October. I'm going to try to spin the wheel 2 more times if there's anybody still out there.